Contrapoints is Anita Sarkeesian 2.0. Okay, another day to check my social media. What's in store? I'll look at the comments of my videos. Hey Prince, I've been a fan of you for a really long time. What's your opinion of Contrapoints? I personally really like you both. Well, it's kind of odd that you watch my channel and yet enjoy Contrapoints, because I'm pretty much the polar opposite in terms of ideas, and I make certain to be clear about explaining my views, as opposed to Contra, who seems to purposefully avoid saying much of anything tangible at all, besides strawmanning and mocking right-wing people, centrists, and coming up with paranoid fantasies about alleged fascists. That is untrue. Maybe you just cannot follow Natalie because of a personal issue you have with understanding highly intellectual video essays. Huh? Yeah, I think the problem is that I do follow the videos, yet most people don't, and they just tune out and think it's either typical SJW nonsense not worth bothering with, or assume that it was highly intellectual because they don't know any better.
No, you're just jealous because Natalie is brilliant and funny and beautiful and has enough subscribers to make you look like an ant, you fedora-wearing neckbeard.
Okay, there's a lot of people that have more subscribers than I do who I'm by no means jealous of or aspire to be like, such as No BS, who isn't constantly promoted by corporate leftist media, by the way. Being jealous of Contrapoints would be kind of like being jealous of Brittany Murphy around the time that she made the movie Spun. Let me guess, you're also fans of Anita Sarkeesian.
No, of course not. Anita Sarkeesian sucks, but Natalie makes really great content because she understands the right wing. None of what you said changes our opinion at all. Natalie is bae, and you are incel.
Alright, time for a trip to the store. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and I absolutely cannot be the only content creator who's noticed the swaths of Contrapoints fanboys seemingly everywhere to the point where it's suspicious. Now, although this video will mostly be about the literal most heinous and what I would guess to be corporate-sponsored creator on all of YouTube, I need to first go over Anita Sarkeesian to properly make my point, even though a lot of you will know everything about her and will find this part semi-boring. Anita Sarkeesian marketed herself as a feminist game critic and rose to internet pop cultural icon status in 2014 with her propaganda series Tropes vs. Women. Her channel, Feminist Frequency, began getting a ton of attention with the Gamergate controversy, as she nitpicked inconsequential or generally non-remarkable bits and pieces of games to basically say that games caused men to be sexist, violent, extra violent towards women specifically, and that they generally encouraged toxic masculinity, however she actually defined it. Gamers hated her, of course, not because she was a woman, and not even simply because they didn't agree with her overall message, which most of them didn't, but because it was seemingly never possible to please this alleged game critic, as all she ever did was focus on essentially everything in these games besides the actual gameplay or legitimate nuances of the stories, in favor of complaining about the way women were depicted in them, or could be depicted in them if you chose to break the rules of the games. However, outside of the actual gaming world, while countless people would love to pretend that this wasn't the case, all sorts of people thought that Anita presented valuable insights into how to change for the better a male-dominated and generally problematic industry and fandom. And as sad as it is for me to admit, I was kinda one of those people for a second. I remember seeing her video about women as rewards and thinking that it made enough sense, though I hadn't been gaming for about a decade. However, I had watched that video living in San Francisco when I was using way too many substances. I was probably stoned at the time, and was surrounded day and night almost exclusively by gay men, so it took me removing myself from that environment by moving cities to realize that there was a massive problem with the feminist worldview at its very foundation due to feminism's hostile takeover of gay male culture, which eventually landed me on YouTube, watching videos like these.
Games, Lara's butt is typically right in the center of the screen, a camera orientation which, along with the sexualized clothing the designers choose to outfit her in, places a tremendous amount of emphasis on that part of her body.
Actually, Laura's butt isn't in the middle there, Anita. In science, we're taught quite early on how to use straight lines for this sort of thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that mathematics is just a tool of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy.
All of a sudden, it was quite clear to me, and seemingly everybody who was actually paying attention, that Anita was using fallacious logic to desperately pin sexism onto any video game, as if she was somebody who had only ever watched people play video games, as opposed to playing them herself, for if she did, she'd have realized that the last thing anybody ever did while playing Tomb Raider was stare at Lara Croft's butt, because if they did, they'd die and have to start over. And I used to play that game. And so, it was to absolutely nobody's surprise when it turned out that she wasn't a gamer at all, and she was entirely a fraud.
Except I'm doing video games. So it's not exactly a fandom. I'm not a fan of video games. I actually had to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this.
To add insult to injury, she had stolen all of her gameplay footage from other people's game playthrough channels, which people figured out after she got some fairly major details in the storyline of the games dramatically wrong, such as the way she tried to claim that the point of one of the Hitman Absolution games was to beat up innocent strippers, because reasons. When in actuality, you were supposed to do no such thing and you were deducted points for doing it. It was at that moment when I realized that although I had once upon a time actually seen some amount of merit in the video about women as rewards, any small semblance of a good argument that anybody could make about video games or gamers being misogynistic was entirely overshadowed by the fact that the person making these arguments was making them in anything but good faith, as she had already reached her conclusion before embarking upon the project, and went out of her way to invent veritable fictions to prove points that in most cases simply didn't exist. And yet still, in spite of the fact that there were millions and millions of views on videos that tore Anita Sarkeesian to shreds as a fraud who made completely silly arguments in a not-so-subtle attempt to try to evangelize gamers into the feminist religion, Anita remained a darling of the mainstream media and corporate leftist political establishment for years, where she still is to this day, being invited to speak as the guest of honor at gaming conventions just a few months ago. Yes, if people didn't figure out that something seriously bizarre was going on by the time she was both being featured on The Colbert Show and was also being flown to speak about misogynistic harassment on the internet in front of the United Nations right before the 2016 election campaign kicked into high gear, as if she was hoping to internationally ban criticisms of the left, feminism. If it wasn't already clear that Anita had a sizable amount of clout in politics, it should have been undeniable that Anita was a corporate teacher's pet after she broke VidCon's rules by insulting and swearing at Sargon of Akkad from her panelist seat, inciting VidCon to apologize to Anita about the incident. But of course, when people ask her what happened over the course of her career as a game critic, I started criticizing the depictions of women in my favorite hobby, gaming, but was viciously attacked by men of the internet who were threatened by the fact that a woman was more popular than most of the male critics were. So I've been the relentless victim of harassment online from trolls. All for the crime of being a woman with an opinion. Though, of course, the internet remained unconvinced.
Look, you can't just start a slow clap at any old time. You gotta wait for the right moment.
But how am I going to know when it's the right moment?
Oh. You'll know.
You see, towards the end of the second half of the Obama years, people were sick to death of subpar social justice grievance mongering from overconfident leftists who legitimately seemed to think they'd never have to critically defend their beliefs, as if everybody would soon be legally obligated to get on board. And so, when it turned out that Anita had made over $1 million from a project that should have been low budget, which she didn't even finish, it didn't surprise me in the least when the social fabric of the internet veered dramatically right-wing just in time for Trump. Now, I'm not saying Anita Sarkeesian personally led to Trump's dramatic upset victory in 2016, but it certainly didn't hurt. So of course, her handlers must have been really furious about the fact that bedroom YouTubers overtook corporate media promoted feminist propaganda content in overall influence. So, while they had already begun trying to figure out ways to thwart political and socio-political content that they didn't like existing on the internet all through 2016, by 2017, it seemed like they had figured out a new, more defensive strategy to fight against the YouTubers that people actually liked. Aside from the shadow banning of Twitter accounts such as my own, the automatic unsubscribing stuff that happens to people who are subscribed to problematic channels, the numerous completely bizarre supposed hate speech strikes that people get for such crimes as, in my case, listing out numerous domestic violence and sex crimes that male feminists have committed, and the algorithm doing everything it can to ensure that people never find our videos in searches and that our videos aren't recommended to anybody, including our subscribers, aside from simply sandboxing channels like my own to ensure that it's almost impossible for us to grow and retain consistent viewership or make any money as they demonetize practically everything we upload, it seems as if there's a new fleet of corporate-favored YouTube content that people tend to call LeftTube. And of course, the flagship channel with the most obviously sizable budget in YouTube terms is Contrapoints, who goes by the name of Natalie Wynn in real life. Being that I was extremely active on YouTube all during 2017 and 2018, both watching videos, making them, and watching and participating in live streams, I ended up hearing of Contrapoints when they debated both Sargon and Blair White, though admittedly I couldn't even watch any more than 20 minutes of either because they just sounded like any other clueless everyday feminism Tumblrite to me. More so, from what little I saw of their videos, the only real difference between Contra's content and something like MTV's Decoded was more of an expansive vocabulary, more run-on sentences, and worse acting. Thus, I accidentally began somewhat of a strange personal journey of sorts in trying to learn about this evolution of SJWism and then criticizing it. Now, I won't bore you with all the details of what happened, but I'll include everything that was important. 1. I politely propositioned Contra to do a live stream with me, even though I barely knew anything about them, simply because I thought that they were actually willing to talk to centrists, and I imagined maybe they were on YouTube in good faith to argue for what is good about the left. Yet I was ignored, which didn't surprise me nor hurt my feelings. Second, I decided as a result of that to watch a lot more of Contra's content, and then made a 16-minute video criticizing Contra's beyond vague politics, deceptive video presentation style, and a bit of speculation about why Contra might be this way, which was immediately demonetized and confirmed with manual review back when the system that allowed you to contest your demonetizations had first been introduced, and it was unheard of to hear back so quickly. I thought to myself at that time, does YouTube give this channel preferential treatment or something? While the video was generally very well received by my audience who agreed with my talking points, I also suddenly became swarmed with dozens and dozens of Contrapoints fans who came to downvote my video and accuse me of misgendering Natalie. And even some comments like these from people who liked the video said the same thing, when in actuality, I did no such thing, as I didn't even use any gendered language and just called them by the name Contra for the whole video, which is what almost every trans person will tell you to do if you are unsure of somebody's pronoun, which most people were at the time, including myself. Third, as a result of all those people hounding me and accusing me of transphobic harassment or something for not misgendering Contra, then eventually Theron Meyer accusing me of incorrect pronoun usage herself, then a fair amount later, Contra just flat out lying to the public and accusing me of wanting to stream about their gender transition? Well, that was just weird, so I ended up making this video because apparently, unbeknownst to me when I first made that video, people were absolutely obsessed with Contra's gender transition for pretty good reason. I mean, let's face it, it's pretty strange to call yourself a cross-dressing, non-misgenderable transvestite for several months, then suddenly transition without making a very clear video to explain to viewers why the sudden change. Many people would clearly see it as a Riley Dennis-style transition. Fourth, after continued relentless badgering from obsessive fans who never even vaguely attempted to bring up my lengthy actual criticisms of Contra's channel, and even a specific sock puppet account from a 15-year-old girl who actually included my name in her Twitter bio and tweeted about me almost exclusively for about 2 weeks upon joining the platform, not to mention posting literally hundreds and hundreds of comments under my videos as if she was very likely being paid to do it or something. I remembered something peculiar that Anita Sarkeesian said once at the XOXO Feminist conference or whatever.
Version 2 is similar but takes it a step further. Anita fakes the threats and harassment she receives on a regular basis, either by sending these threats to herself via sock puppet accounts or by enlisting an army of feminists to do it for her. Where is that army? Seriously.
You see, here's the thing. Anybody who was around in this sphere of YouTube during Gamergate, or even a year or two later, remembers that everybody said that there was endless sock puppet accounts that would come after anybody who criticized Anita online, and they obviously didn't just make that up. Similarly, many people suspected that the majority of the followers of Feminist Frequency on Twitter were actually sock puppets. Additionally, one real-life feminist ended up literally having a man arrested in Canada and put on trial for 3 years over an online argument having to do with Anita. Now, I wasn't personally around for the thick of the Anita Sarkeesian drama and had to learn about it later. However, being that I've dealt with my own fair share of online feminist bullies by the time I started red-pilling myself in 2015, I never doubted that there were hordes of minions who patrolled the internet in her name, and many people eventually provided a lot of tangible evidence that pointed to that. Thus, I had to wonder whether or not something similar was happening with Contrapoints, even though, at the time, Contrapoints only had about 40,000 subscribers or so, and most people didn't even know of this person. Maybe there was an organized force of Contrapoints trolls out there, perhaps even being paid in some case, which is kind of what it seemed like with the 15-year-old girl who stalked me. It's a really long story, and I won't get into it. Thus, as a result of being reminded of this channel's existence literally every day for several months from all of that, I put together some more clues about why this person might be similarly corporate-backed in the literal exact same way that Anita Sarkeesian fairly obviously was, with a production team behind Contrapoints that knows what they are doing a bit better than they did with Anita, and a much higher budget than Anita's fairly low-quality videos that never even got finished. I mean, Anita raised $1 million, but clearly didn't use it all on her videos. I'll give you guys the clues, starting with the earliest ones. The first thing we should note is that even in Contra's old, low-budget videos, before Contra got hundreds or $1,000 worth of lighting, way better editing, thousands of dollars worth of wigs, costumes, makeup, props, etc., and what I suspect to be joke writers that livened up the scripts with edgy, but usually completely inane and irrelevant humor, Contrapoints had a framed picture of Anita Sarkeesian in the background of their videos. This seemed like a fairly obvious and legitimate dog whistle to the left, which definitely could have been inspired by Matt Christensen's channel, which had a framed picture of Milo Yiannopoulos in the background, so by itself, it might not have seemed all that weird. However, as time went on, it started to become clear that Contra was doing more than just dog whistling about Anita, and apparently they were friends. Judging by this art that Contrapoints commissioned for Anita, and then not long after that, Contra appeared on the Feminist Frequency podcast. So it was kind of beyond obvious. We can only guess how they became friends. Eventually, more and more blog articles started coming out about Contrapoints being the best political commentary on YouTube. I guess with the Young Turks and Cat Black as the only competition. And similar to Anita, this almost certainly only reached all sorts of blue pill individuals who don't actually know anything about YouTube, similar to the way that I learned about Feminist Frequency back when I was relatively blue pilled myself. Then, Contrapoints ended up speaking themselves at the exact same festival that Anita had in 2014, which I showed the footage of earlier, XOXO, but in 2018. And Contra basically sounded almost exactly the same in terms of saying things that anybody who really follows YouTube and the culture war would immediately know are untrue.
And I guess I realized in last year that I need to transition. It wasn't an option. It was just what I had to do to live, be alive. And that was unfortunate for my YouTube career because...
Similarly complaining about how mean people are on the internet in the exact same way Anita did.
Because I had watched for a long time the way trans women, all women really, are treated on YouTube. And so when I realized that me, as this person with this anti-4chan Nazi YouTube channel, was going to now have to become a trans woman, I was like, oh shit. I'm very thoroughly fucked.
And of course, Contra contradicts themselves pretty blatantly over the course of that speech, which Contra has a habit of doing regularly, which is why I often call them self-contradictopoints.
So, I used to be a little bit of a man. I'm not proud of it, but these things happen. We all make mistakes. More generally speaking, it's not a good idea to be a woman.
Another odd thing is that while I believe, though don't quote me on this, that Contrapoints pretends to be similarly nonpartisan in the way that Anita Sarkeesian did, Contra not so subtly advocated that people vote for Democrats in the video about the apocalypse that they released, which of course was about global warming, a tried and true Democratic Party talking point, because, of course, Obama did legalize propaganda, so if the Democrats wanted to sponsor Contra, it would be legal.
And if you're American, vote this monumental ding-dong out of the Oval Office in 2020 before the entire planet shrinks and transforms into a corn cob. So let me get this straight. You want me to go vegan, drive a Prius, and vote Democrat. You're basically asking me to completely change who I am as a person and become everything I hate. Yeah, pretty much.
Also, just over a month ago or so, Vice magazine dropped a short little documentary for Contra, which is basically an advertisement for the channel, which of course tries a bit too hard to sell people on a completely idealized version of Contra's career.
Natalie Wynn is trying to de-radicalize YouTube. She uses 15 wigs, $1,000 in props, and hours of makeup to make 30-minute videos about the political fights of the internet. She creates dialogues between characters and plays all of them. She writes, films, edits it all herself.
How could I possibly be a Nazi?
The result is a pretty complex discussion about subjects like the alt-right, transgender pronouns.
Now, I assure you, as somebody who's actually worked with fancy lighting and with props, excessive makeup and wigs, etc., that's almost certainly untrue. The whole thing, especially with the corporate Vice magazine video promotion, reeks of corporate sponsorship by itself. I'd honestly say that even if Contra was vaguely funny off the cuff, which isn't true, and thus could write decent jokes into their scripts, considering how non-funny they are on streams, there's basically no way Contra is writing all those jokes, setting up all that lighting while in those ridiculous costumes and caked-on makeup, then repositioning it all for each new scene. Not to mention the good editing, which Contra seemingly wasn't capable of back before 2018, when it became somewhat public that YouTube was sponsoring channels. I don't know. Maybe Contra's intern, Theron, helps. And of course, you can look for yourself. The comment section under the Vice video is overrun with gushing comments from people who can't all be real, claiming things like, Contrapoints is the greatest philosopher and intellectual comedian to ever grace the internet. Natalie Wynn saved me from being alt-right. And then even this comment, which I think is overselling it. Of course, I can't prove that's a fake account or anything, but it kind of seems like all sorts of them are overselling their alleged fandom of the most heinous YouTuber on the platform. Also, there's this mysterious channel who sprung up less than a month ago, claiming that he used to be alt-light, and already has more than a few subscribers, even though he only has a few awful videos. And the kicker? He claims Contrapoints was his inspiration.
I came across another YouTuber called Contrapoints. And Natalie, I mean, I had this aversion to her at first because I had all these goofy ideas about trans people. But Natalie, she spoke to me. She spoke my language. She was like one of me. We were about the same age, and
no, Contrapoints is older than you. Like they're like old enough to be like grooming you.
She understood the culture that I was in. She understood the memes. She understood the philosophy. She understood the motivations, and she was able to repeat back to me why I found it so compelling. Whereas when I would talk to most leftists or liberals, they wouldn't know. They would just call me a racist. And to be honest with you, and this is part of the reason I'm making this video, is to help educate people, that didn't work. That pushed me further and further away. The only thing that made me believe was that I'm the red-pilled one.
Oh, gee. That totally didn't seem like an actor trying to oversell a corporate product at all. Obviously, if the progressive left was sponsoring YouTube videos, they'd never try way too hard to get people to like a small pack of YouTube channels to maintain some influence on the internet by having an army of trolls and actors singing their praises and acting like they are hip. I mean, assuming he isn't trolling Contrapoints and their fans, but regardless, it just kind of seems like he's trying to show something to investors so that they feel good about having invested in Contra, or whatever.
Donald Trump thinks building a wall will make America great again, but that's none of my business. My business is a foreign policy so good, you'll want a Harlem Shake.
Now, one of the reasons Contrapoints keeps getting praise, at least from the seeming sock puppets and actors, is that Contrapoints speaks to and communicates with the right wing. This is blatantly untrue, of course, because although Contra did do a stream with Blair White and Sargon, who, by the way, aren't even right-wing but centrists anyhow, the literal only other right-wing-ish person Contra has ever done any sort of debate or stream with that I know of is Roaming Millennial. Now, Roaming Millennial is, no offense, so incredibly nice that Contra was never truly pressed on the tough questions Contra gave insufficient answers for, and it honestly seemed kind of scripted, as if Contra had already formulated each response ahead of time. And of course, Contra's answers are ridden with doublethink, blatant self-contradictions, and Contra often stating things that are about one molecule away from full-blown lies, like the following.
Well, Theron actually pointed this out to me. She showed me there's a clip of an interview with Peterson on a podcast somewhere where he's kind of pushed on the non-binary thing, and he actually says at some point that like he's sure that there is probably some kind of biological or genetic basis for some people being sort of atypical with respect to gendered traits, and perhaps that being a foundation of non-binary gender. So he actually probably believes that there is such a thing as non-binary genders. Like I think he actually believes that. So
okay. It's a bit more than a leap and a bound to state that because Professor Kermit thinks that there is likely some biological and or genetic basis for androgynous people, or whatever he actually meant, that this therefore means that he acknowledges the validity of non-binary people, who, remember, are usually white girls, claiming that they have no gender at all, thus feeling perfectly entitled to demand they-them pronouns from everybody around them. And I think Contra knows that perfectly well. Soon after, Lauren Chen, aka Roaming Millennial, asks a fairly straightforward question, obviously hoping for a clear answer that I'm sure Contra could have easily given her, but of course, as if Contra has something to hide, they sidestepped it and went in like 4 directions in under a minute.
In other words, it's good to have within a workplace or within academia a set of rules that say, look, if a person, if you know their pronouns, don't misgender them, because this essentially it's bullying. It's like using racial slurs. It's very it makes things very uncomfortable for trans people, and there's just no reason to do it. So I think that for the sake of keeping universities from being very difficult places for trans people to be, I think it's a reasonable rule. I
guess for that, would you say that someone's refusal to recognize non-binary identities, either to an individual or just conceptually, would you define that as bullying in and of itself?
So not conceptually. If someone argues like that they don't think that there is such a thing as a non-binary gender, I think that it's an idea that can be discussed and that maybe needs to be discussed, especially since this is an idea that I think most people are not familiar with. I do think, though, that it's good for there to be a norm that if someone says, call me they, them, you just call them they, them, or you make a good faith effort to, I think that, and that's as far as it really goes. I think there's this whole thing about ZZ or pronouns that it's just like, I asked my question to the audience, how many people in your life do you know that insist on ZZ or pronouns? This issue is like really blown out.
Well, yeah. I mean, I know we hear about it a lot, but I've only in my life met one person who asked to be called they, them.
Worse, when Lauren does the unthinkable and actually asks a completely clear and great question in the same vein as Jordan Peterson's actual criticisms of Canada's Bill C-16, Contra basically refuses to answer by doing something leftists love to do. Just reframe the question entirely and answer a question Lauren Chen didn't even ask.
But I think there is a difference to be made between that and compelled speech, right? Because in the pronoun issue, regardless, and again, like this isn't something that every person has to deal with by any means, but there is a difference between saying, hey, you can't say this, and saying, hey, you must say this. And I guess for someone who is very strong in their opposition to the idea of non-binary genders, saying that you have to call someone Z or Zer could be interpreted as saying you have to admit that this is real by the fact that you are using that pronoun.
Yeah, so I think that, well, let's not do Z and Zer because that's just too much of a distraction. But suppose someone is like, they just refuse to accept that the validity of trans people's gender in general. Should such a person be like required by law to...
And then, to add insult to injury, much later in the stream, Contra finally shows their true colors and basically admits that if a non-binary identified Stalin or Chairman Mao-like character was rising to power, that person would have Contra's full support or something, as if they were comrades or whatever.
But I get what you're saying. There's a difference between a government law versus something that we accept as common etiquette. You can't go into a workplace and just yell penis, vagina.
Yeah.
Right. I guess I would still disagree with the idea that you have a right to be comfortable. You have a right to be made safe in an area. But and so this is a kind of relates to something that someone else asked. This is from Bost. Question: where does she Contra think the line should be drawn? What if someone calls her he in a classroom? What should the consequences be? So I guess we're talking now about what is and what is not acceptable. But when it comes to this institutional code or whatever, again, not government, do you think that things like expulsion are reasonable, or I guess having something on your permanent record or whatever?
Yeah, I mean the way I would imagine this works is, and the way academic discipline usually works, like you get a warning, don't do this, then you start getting suspensions and things. That seems a reasonable way for me to deal with it. And again, I'm not saying this is because I have a right to be comfortable, to be not offended. We're on YouTube right now. I understand that people in the comments section are going to say horrible things about me, and
we're both Jewish apparently.
Contra was clearly actively avoiding answering the question initially, because if those two statements came immediately after each other in a clear way, it would prove that Peterson was entirely correct, and that people like Contra do precisely want exactly what he feared: a way to persecute non-intersectional, gender deconstructionist people on campus and in workplace environments, helping to give the far left leverage in ruining the lives of anybody who crosses them, as they can always blow the whistle on accidental misgendering of usually white, obviously female-looking people like this, if you don't call this person they. And so, if Contra is so incredibly cagey and unwilling to answer questions, is it any wonder why they merely give lip service to the concept of speaking to the right, but has also essentially bragged about the fact that they won't do debates?
If Dave Rubin ever left his echo chamber, would either of you ever go on his show, and how do you think that could work out?
Well, on my channel there's been kind of an ongoing joke about me trying to go on his show. For the time being, I kind of don't do anything like that. I just been turning all these things down because I just don't feel like dealing with it. I hope I get to a point where I sort of get over that. Ruben, I might make an exception for because it's been such a trope that I feel like if anyone gave me trouble for that, I could simply point them to everything I've ever said about him. Yeah.
Contra knows they'd lose. Yet, of course, Contra's sock puppet army would try to have you believe that, well, Natalie makes videos that are designed to appeal to the right wing. That's what Natalie means when she says she speaks to the right wing. As if that's the same as communicating with right-wing people, which it isn't. Or as if that's even true, because practically all Contra ever does is mock and lie about right-wing and even centrists in the videos.
And of course, another advantage of using innocuous symbols is that when leftists try to point those symbols out, the fascists can always say, "These gullible SJWs now think that even the OK sign is racist. Is there anything they don't think is racist?" And the gullible centrists will be taken right in. The poor centrists. They're so afraid that Antifa is going to punch them because of their hair or their emoji. And you know, some leftists are assholes or idiots.
Funny how, according to Contra, I guess everybody who is right of centrism is a fascist, while centrist channels are sandboxed on YouTube and shadow banned in most places, and the only channels that don't seem to be sandboxed are progressives, which has been a communist dog whistle since at least the 40s. Obviously, Contra avoids talking to actual right-wing people because Contra doesn't actually understand right-wing arguments, and has even admitted that they didn't understand libertarianism in the least when they were in freaking grad school for philosophy, which is weird because libertarianism is fairly philosophical last time I checked.
And the reading we were discussing that week was libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. None of us were able to mount any kind of plausible argument against Nozick, not because Nozick is correct, but because we as a group had no experience arguing with anything that far to the right.
Regardless, I do understand right-wing arguments as well as left-wing arguments, so I want to actually talk about Contra's content, because that's honestly what is most concerning to me, and I don't think all that many people understand just how wretched it is. You see, I've said numerous times that Contra is the worst channel on YouTube, and I legitimately mean that, but what I think people aren't following about my statement is that I'm not saying that the videos are the most poorly made technically, or even the least entertaining videos on the platform. No, in spite of the fact that I find them incessantly boring and can't stand literally anybody who spends about 95% of their often 45-minute videos avoiding any actual substance regarding simple arguments that I could easily formulate in about 5 minutes, I will concede that I can see why some people find these videos entertaining, and I'll admit that they're technically well put together. However, Contrapoints is nothing more than a blatant propagandist, and while I'll admit that it's actually fairly sophisticated and well thought out propaganda, that only makes me loathe it all the more, as dishonesty that people are going to be more apt to mistake for well-reasoned arguments is the most dangerous kind. I'll go through a few examples of Contra's video dishonesty in a moment, but I first want to briefly explain how Contra's style of dishonesty works. Generally, Contra relies on 3 major tactics to make it appear that Contra has presented something logical to the audience, when upon further examination that's anything but the truth. The tactics tend to be dishonestly framing the topics of conversation into what Contra wants the audience to believe somebody else was talking about, engaging in self-contradictory doublethink madness to pay lip service to oppositional views without actually addressing those, and accusing people of the literal exact things that Contra and other leftist propagandists do regularly. Things which the people being accused of often don't do, assuming these people even exist and that they aren't straw men of fictitious fascists or whatever. Here's an example of reframing, where Contra strawmans their political opponent's speech or vernacular into something it clearly wasn't intended to be. Note that there's a frenetic visual background behind the text presented, obscuring the viewer's ability to read it easily, while unnecessary music is being played. This is psychologically disarming, and a propaganda tactic itself, designed to obstruct people's critical thinking, but I'll get back to that later.
To begin, let's take a look at what fascism is. Contemporary fascists share 3 core beliefs. 1. People of European heritage are or ought to constitute a biological, cultural, and political unity known as the white race, sometimes dog-whistled as Western culture.
This is obviously one of many attempts Contrapoints and their comrades utilize to delegitimize this common phrase that's been around for probably over 100 years, which I remember even far leftists using in the 90s to describe capitalistic liberal democracies who mostly speak English or Romantic languages, generally in North America and Europe, but also in Australia. The term is even used to describe places like Japan and Hong Kong due to their ties to the United States government as well as European ones. No, Contra. Clearly not even a vaguely significant portion of people who refer to Western culture are referring to white identitarianism. And I believe you actually know that perfectly well, which is what really creeps me out about you, and must play a role in why you won't debate. In fact, I'm completely confident Contra purposefully tries to help the ADL and Hillary Clinton era 2016 to label all sorts of things as alt-right dog whistles, with the explicit intention on making the left paranoid so that the red and blacks can be more easily radicalized, because Contra is their internet queen.
This ideology, he was deep in it. And he was repeating back to me all the things that I believed. And I watched that video and he just murdered those fucking people. They didn't even put up a fight. He just slaughtered them. And then I saw the memes. He was memeing the whole time. And it made me realize that I had shared those same memes. Some of them I shared ironically, because I thought they were ridiculous and I was shit posting, and some of them I saw as spreading my message. And I realized how this wasn't an isolated thing. This wasn't just something that I was going through, that I was influencing the world.
I mean, after the New Zealand tragedy and this oh-so-sincere guy, Contra gets to say, "See, I told you so. My propaganda career is justified." I'm not, happy, though. But even if memes magically, by themselves, actually really radicalized the guy in New Zealand, who is more responsible for that, Contra? You with your 1.2 million views on that video, who eagerly swore this stuff was true, or somebody like Sargon, who did everything he could to delegitimize Pepe as being alt-right. But I will be making an entire video about that topic. Regardless, this is a problem because Contra didn't just commit that intellectual sleight of hand in that one video by claiming fascists dog whistle white identitarianism by calling the West, but made an entire video based around delegitimizing the very concept of the West later in their career on a seemingly higher budget. In this video, which does everything it can to not be clear and concise, another psychologically disarming tactic, by the way, Contra basically argues that what most people consider the West is a combination of Judeo-Christian values and Enlightenment values, which means that the very concept of the West is somewhat unfounded because part of Enlightenment values is secularism and constant reformation, which means that Judeo-Christian values aren't an essential facet of it, at least any more than Islam might be, because Muslim scholars transcribed ancient Greek philosophy for a saint to read. Though that argument isn't really true, as it's possible for a society to be more or less Judeo-Christian culturally, but have a more or less secular government, not to mention also having a firm aversion to Islam, as Islam is diametrically oppositional to both Enlightenment and Judeo-Christian values. However, aside from spending way too long to fail at delegitimizing the concept of the West, in a way only somebody that isn't the least bit familiar with the European Enlightenment wouldn't notice, Contra does manage to slip in one actual argumentative talking point in that 23-minute video, which is...
So when a new movement comes along, like for instance a bunch of buzzkill sad sacks pointing out that actually our society is still pretty terrible to women, people of color, and gender and sexual minorities, it might not be the smartest thing to just dismiss it as some kind of sinister postmodern neo-Marxist cuckoldry. It could be the next Reformation, in a history marked by a series of reformations. If there are any historians watching this, please call it the SJW Reformation.
If you looked at that by itself, it would actually be very small, but what Contra managed to slip in was basically the whole point of the video. An actual dog whistle of its own to the veritably communist intersectional feminist far left, in which Contra is signaling to people already converted to the postmodern neo-Marxist ideology, better known currently as intersectional feminism, that they are on the same team and that they basically just want to topple the West. But, to those not converted, Contra is first attempting to destroy their beliefs in the validity of the fabrics of the society that have thriving capitalistic liberal democracies, and replace it with a new belief system called social justice, which has been a full-blown communist dog whistle for probably 6 decades. And of course, Contra isn't too shy about admitting their true colors in other videos.
And you got Marxism with its analysis of bourgeoisie and proletariat.
Next, here's an example of self-contradictory doublethink that I believe had to have been calculated and deliberate, and it's in this video about how race isn't real because Contra says so, due to the fact that the racial classifications that we more than often use to this day were drafted excessively long ago, back before genetic science was even a thing. Granted, this is true to a certain degree, but Contra then goes on to claim that race isn't real, as if Contra has some sort of great understanding of genetics, after being a Marxist who dropped out of a philosophy program at university, which is fairly obviously untrue if you actually know anything about genetics, which I kinda do, as I was the top of my class in the second genetics class I took at university.
So there are no distinct boundaries separating continental populations from each other, and the continental populations themselves are not homogeneous. This is evident when you look at, for instance, the distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups across the globe. Categories like white, black, and Asian are therefore extremely arbitrary ways of dividing up the genetic continuum. In fact, there is no purely genetic justification for using, say, 5 race categories as opposed to just 1, or 300, or 3 million.
Now, forget about the fact that genetics is one of the most rapidly advancing sciences on the face of the earth, and that Contra was using that map from 2005, thus making it completely obsolete, more or less. Though honestly, that would make my knowledge obsolete too, so that's why I'm going to move on. In case you swallowed that info without thinking about it skeptically, because you were distracted by the hypnotizing music or whatever, the countering argument would be to say something like, sure, maybe you shouldn't divide races into 5 categories. Maybe we should divide them into more like 20 or 30, based around various common pools of genetic phenotype groupings from around the world. But of course, Contra doesn't think anything of the sort, because after Contra went to all that trouble to basically claim that there's only one race, the human race, Contra ends up saying at the end of the video,
race may be a social construct, but it's not an illusion. It's real in the way that money is real. It affects the way we all experience the world, and real people are privileged and disadvantaged because of it. So even if our goal is a society where race doesn't exist, we can't get there by denying the political reality of race and racial injustice. Colorblindness, in other words, is not the answer. However,
clearly, it would seem if you look at the self-contradiction between those two ideas, that Contrapoints is basically trying to say, you're only allowed to claim that genetic phenotypes have different notable grouping differentiations between populations if you agree with my leftist politics, or something silly like that. Because although it sounds like Contra might want meritocracy, Contra definitely still wants affirmative action. Just no race realism or actually treating each other as equals allowed. But of course, being that the video is about 15 minutes of seemingly purposefully obfuscated filler, designed to disarm the audience's patience and thus critical thinking, most people don't pick up on what was really being said and how self-contradicting it was. Next, let's look at Contra's video about Jordan Peterson, where within 2 minutes, Contrapoints blatantly lies about Jordan Peterson's objection to Bill C-16, kind of like what they were saying in the live stream with Lauren Chen.
So who's Jordan Peterson? Well, he's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto who got famous for sounding the alarm about how protecting transgender people under Canadian human rights law shall surely lead to Stalinism.
No, Contra. Literally everybody who has actually followed Jordan Peterson knows that he's said dozens and dozens of times that
a person is compelled under Canadian law to use the pronoun of another individual's choice on pain of law. And I thought, well, no, that's not acceptable. It's one thing to put limits on what a person can't say, like say with hate speech laws, which I also don't agree with, by the way, but that's a different argument. I think it's a narrower argument.
But he continues.
But to compel me to use a certain content when I'm formulating my thoughts or my actions under threat of legislative action, I thought, no, what's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game.
However, the thing is that Contra is not actually attempting to fairly argue against Jordan Peterson in any way, shape, or form, because clearly, Contra's video is not intended for fans or people who have actually checked out Peterson in the least. Rather, Contra's video's target audience is clearly the out-to-lunch blue pill crowd who knows nothing about Jordan Peterson besides the fact that all of their feminist friends hate him, but won't say exactly why. So Contra pretends to give them a well-reasoned and detailed video about why Peterson can be dismissed, but does so by simply lying about him. I won't go through more of that video because, well, of course it's really long, but I can assure any actual fans of Peterson's work who follow his talking points and why he is worried about the rise of the identitarian neo-Marxist left and compelled speech, especially in regards to gender-neutral pronouns, that you will find the video completely dishonest. I even made this video, which debunks some more of Contra's video about Peterson. Finally, the last thing I said I would mention was going to be about accusing people of exactly what Contra does themselves.
Sometimes irony can be a safe way to explore ideas that you're not quite ready to own yet.
Now, honestly, everybody does that, including myself and including Contrapoints, and Contrapoints admits to that. Which is one of the reasons why I look at Contrapoints videos and sometimes miss the cooler people in the left. See what I did there? But problem is, Contrapoints takes it a step too far right here.
But there's more than one way to be authentic. You don't have to be a diarist. You can also be a novelist, metaphorically speaking. So it's possible to express yourself through lying, or you can be yourself by becoming someone else. So this is a technique that I've used on my channel to...
Okay, I'm gonna stop you right there, because I think that the better thing to say is that actually you just lie about things that are demonstrably true or untrue, claiming it's the other. And there's also all sorts of things that Contrapoints accuses other people of doing that they do all the time. Anyhow, but in reality, everybody is able to tell when Contra is actually serious, such as how they were when they said that Enlightenment values should be replaced with social justice, or maybe that they are being, and obviously that Contra wants that. But sadly, a lot of people don't understand that basically all Contra does is state dishonesties, spew doublethink, and contradict themselves, including people that were at some point actually fans of Peterson, right-wing pundits like Ben Shapiro, or centrist channels like Sargon's and my own. Yes, as I've stated at the beginning of this video, assuming they aren't all sock puppets or paid trolls or whatever, it's been a very peculiar thing to find out that some people who have enjoyed my channel immensely and have repeatedly donated money to me or are generous patrons of Sargon's and thus are in his more exclusive Discord rooms, have ended up becoming Contrapoints fans and failing to understand why on earth I would criticize this YouTuber. But you see, as hard as it is for a lot of people to fully admit, Anita Sarkeesian as well actually was a very controversial turning point on YouTube back in 2014 and 2015, as it was around that time that numerous otherwise rational atheist channels like Steve Shives forsook their atheist beliefs and fell for the feminist religion without ever admitting that a religion is precisely what it is. And although I wasn't around to witness it, many of these people sided with Anita Sarkeesian ahead of her critics. That's yet another reason why it seems as if Contrapoints is a similar figure. Only it was a lot easier to debunk Anita. Now, there's a number of reasons why people are going the Contrapoints route, so I'll just list a few of them from the get-go. For one, the type of content once known as anti-SJW or the skeptic sphere is but a pale imitation of what it once was, because so many of those channels threw in the towel after their videos were demonetized. They could no longer grow in terms of subscribers due to all of the systemic sabotage type reasons I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and also because it was hard to find good bedroom feminist style videos to make responses to. And unlike myself, a lot of those channels did rely a lot on response videos. Being that there weren't a whole lot of people making response videos to that type of content, it was easier for the news stars of LeftTube to get more views and subscribers, being that, as Tim Pool highlighted in this video about the algorithm's recommendation, leftist YouTubers do definitely get preferential treatment in the algorithms, and we can assume YouTube doesn't automatically unsubscribe people from their channels. Next, seemingly all of the LeftTube usual suspects employ a strategy of making their videos excessively long, which makes them relatively response-proof, as most response videos are made by going through the majority of the statements within each short video. But people would be worried about making an hour-long video debunking 3 arrows or Sean. As I already mentioned about Contra's deliberate obfuscation of their own points, it's almost as if Contra was coached into making videos long, indirect, and conversationally obtuse and thus confusing, which would make it harder for people to easily respond to, simply due to how daunting and tedious of a task it would be to respond to a 45-minute video full of run-on sentences, $2 words, humoristic subject changes, and alleged points that go all the way to Zimbabwe and back. But you see, obfuscation by itself is a psychologically disarming tactic, like I mentioned before, and it by no means merely serves to make it hard to respond and debunk the sorry excuse for logic within these videos. No, Contra is not simply trying to make it hard to make response videos, but rather, Contrapoints is attempting to intellectually wear out your skepticism, because for whatever psychological reason, when viewers feel like they don't entirely follow something that at least sounds to them as if it's intelligent and well put together, most people will decide to agree with it, at least if they already wanted to, in spite of the fact that they don't even entirely understand what exactly they are signing up for. Now, I'm not an expert of psychology, so I can't exactly explain in great detail why that is, but as a person who did study media, writing, and theater almost exclusively at university, and even interned at a film distribution company, I'm very well versed in the ways in which both propagandists like Contrapoints and even advertisers use the same tactics to disarm people's critical thinking for their own ends. Many of these psychological manipulation tactics were developed during World War II by communist dictators like Joseph Stalin and arguably socialist fascists like Hitler. I would probably veer on the side of saying that he was as socialist as any other dictator, because, people say that real socialism has never been tried anyway, so he was somebody who tried. The first psychologically disarming tactic I'll note in detail is irrelevant humor. Humor can be entertaining, obviously, and it can serve to drive the points of any video home, such as the jokes in Bering's videos, which almost unanimously are used to run with the actual arguments on the table in a logical, albeit funny, way. When watching Bering, you never have to think to yourself, why the hell did he just make that joke? Because he makes it very clear as to why he'd make these jokes. However, Contrapoints does almost no such thing ever. The jokes in Contrapoints videos are generally some combination of, first, absurdity of the most shallow nature imaginable.
So Jordan, Dr. Peterson, Professor, Daddy, let's talk. And for once, I'd like to actually treat this discussion with the seriousness and respect I think it deserves.
Second, completely juvenile prodding of people that are smarter than them.
For example, the French postmodernist
Michel Foucault,
Sargon, you little goose,
Michel Foucault
wrote intellectual histories.
And third, which I already mentioned, those that are only partially jokes, but you end up having trouble discerning which parts of the statements are joking and which are supposed to be serious.
I think to people watching this, it comes off as if leftists are afraid of his actual ideas. But I'm not afraid of his ideas. I'm not afraid of anything. I just smoked a bunch of fucking PCP. Daddy. So I spent the last couple weeks listening to hours of Peterson's lectures and podcasts and reading his books.
Sure, there's an element of truth to the last statement, but since it's presented as a joke, it not only allows Contra to skirt out of any responsibility for the ways people interpret their statements, like Contra seemed to demonize before, but it also largely serves to distract and confuse viewers, albeit slightly, thus disarming their critical thinking, at least momentarily. These types of humor being put into the scripts are designed to intellectually exhaust you, so that you just end up accepting as truth the obviously extremely serious statements that are delivered, even though they are by no means profound.
It might not be the smartest thing to just dismiss it as some kind of sinister postmodern neo-Marxist cuckoldry. It could be the next Reformation, in a history marked by a series of Reformations. If there are any historians watching this, please call it the SJW Reformation.
Next, I want to talk about the music and frenetic visuals. Although mere distractions, these things are designed, again, to both confuse and subtly manipulate viewers, and are actually most commonly used in advertising, not just in television and web commercials, but even in storefronts, and, worst of all, in the mall, which is basically just a giant psychological manipulation megaplex designed to make you stay all day and buy as much stuff as possible. Think about going to the mall for a moment. The first thing you generally notice is that they are playing fairly loud pop music, and that there's bright lights everywhere. Not unlike a Contrapoints video, though Contra's lighting is usually a bit dimmer, but there's a lot of shades to it. And different things work for different contexts. At the mall, you're first disoriented with a sensory overload, which can distract you entirely from what initially brought you to the mall in the first place, as you'll very often end up going to whichever store looks appealing first. For me, I often go to get shoes or something, but first go to GameStop. This is done on purpose, of course, and they also do other things. They put stores of similar types usually on the far end of the mall from each other, so that if they don't have, say, the right kind of cell phone that you wish to purchase at the first place that you go, you'll have to walk all the way through the mall to find the phone kiosk that hopefully has the new Samsung in stock or whatever, forcing you to walk by, you guessed it, GameStop, when you can't actually afford any new releases and the phone. Another thing they do deliberately, which seems totally bizarre to most people, is that they often tilt the maps of the mall to the side, so that north will be where east is supposed to be, and you thus get momentarily confused just long enough to see small advertisements for each store. More so, since most people end up walking around quite a lot in the malls, they also become tired eventually, and since it takes so long, very often hungry, which is why there's always a food court. And to add insult to injury, people are more likely to go back and buy that extra pair of shoes that they can't afford, or that video game, after thinking about how much they want them during a meal. That being said, Contrapoints videos are basically the exact same thing. They have music going on, but it serves a different purpose. Contrapoints uses different styles of background music, depending upon what Contra is trying to say about a speaker or idea at any time. For example, when Contrapoints is trying to make fun of dead old white men from past centuries with outdated ideas, which happens in a huge percentage of Contra's videos, there's always cringy sounding pretentious classical music, reminding people of the more annoying white people they've met, which makes people know for sure that Contra is playing a character that the audience is supposed to hate.
Welcome to my very scientific race laboratory. May the pure light of reason guide us. We'll begin by measuring the superior dimensions of the Caucasoids.
However, when Contrapoints is trying to say something that is supposed to be intelligent, and you're supposed to agree with it, there is always this vaguely hypnotic, subtly positive sounding, psychedelic-ish electronic type music, as far as background music goes, because I guess the college kids still smoke reefer. So next time, they'll surely Pokemon Go to the polls.
In the next couple decades, this is going to be capitalism's great Chinese famine moment, only potentially it'll be much, much worse. This is probably the most important issue facing humanity in the 21st century, so we kinda need to fix it by any means necessary, beginning with rapid political change. If that means direct action, it means direct action.
I also noted before that Contra's videos are full of visual distractions, such as repeatedly putting long-winded paragraphs visually displayed upon a hard-to-read background, which makes most people tune out entirely, thinking to themselves, "Wow, she's really smart. What she said must be true," without actually really reading it or even listening to it all that much, because you're simultaneously looking at something and listening to a long-winded paragraph. But of course, I personally usually pause for a second to read it, and it more than often is completely dishonest, untrue, or self-contradicting, like the way these two statements simply do not reflect reality, because in terms of most of the people that Contra is describing right here, if you've ever met a bunch of them, these types of postmodern identity politics people and the hardline Marxists, if you've ever met a bunch of them, which I have, these people almost always encompass traits of each supposedly distinct grouping of people. And yet Contrapoints acts like they are totally different and separate. Now, I'm not saying that some amount of music and well-done background writing can't be useful for videos. There's a channel called Counter Arguments that I like quite a lot, and it utilizes music as well as somewhat graphically designed text to further their points, but it makes good arguments and I don't find the channel misleading. Overall, Contrapoints videos are mostly meant to assure people of nothing more than that the left is still really, really smart by overstimulating and exhausting the viewers into forgetting to pay attention, in the same way that the mall exhausts you to get you to buy more stuff, as both things have flashy visuals that most people find somewhat fun, tons of distraction like try-hard edgy humor, or booths where you can pay $7 to go on a virtual reality roller coaster or stunt plane or something. Both things are designed to do nothing more than to manipulate you into buying things. In the case of malls, it's usually a bag half full of stuff you don't really need and can't necessarily afford, plus maybe a small bag of chocolate-covered gummy bears because you never tried them. But in Contrapoints' case, one of the biggest reasons that it exists is to counter Jordan Peterson's arguments and sell the audience on one of the things Contra has gotten most popular claiming, which is the idea that postmodern neo-Marxism isn't a thing, because of untrue reasons that most people can't follow with the overly long wording, visually distracting background, and because most people don't entirely know what postmodernism or Marxism even are. And then in other videos, Contrapoints just tries to convince people to be postmodern neo-Marxists. It's for those reasons why I think Contra is the most heinous individual or team of individuals on the platform of YouTube. Because if the propaganda tactics of an allegedly single-person channel are approximately as sophisticated as those in a mall, you should be afraid of who is backing the channel. Very, very afraid. All right. Thanks for staying with me until the end. This video took several months to fully feel ready to make, and a long time to write and finish, so if you could spare me some money or subscribe to my channel, I'd really appreciate it, as I need about $900 to pay for the next episode of my animation series, The Culture War is Lit, which, if you have the time to watch, I hope you'll enjoy, as I'm a real playwright and it's gonna have an actual plot, as opposed to a philosophy dropout that probably is corporately sponsored like Contra and makes skits that don't really make any sense and are totally boring and weird. That's all.